As she unboxed the 90 smartphone I paid for, my 13-year-old niece chuckled, "Mom says nobody would even care if you vanished tomorrow." The room burst into laughter, except me. I just nodded, opened my phone, and with 2 quick taps, terminated every link, banks, bills, autopays. Done. Later that evening, I packed up, cut them off, and disappeared, leaving behind a single black bag. What they discovered inside. I'm Julian Knox, 37, currently a freelance media editor for Company B's regional branch, and while my job isn't glamorous or stable, it pays just enough to keep the lights on and gives me enough time to help the very people who seem to have forgotten that help is not something owed, it's something chosen. And today, I realized my choice was over. The room was crowded with familiar faces and unfamiliar tones, a birthday party meant for my older sister's daughter, balloons taped to the ceiling, a cake sweating under the dim lights, and voices raised more out of competition than celebration. All of them louder than reason, louder than empathy, and none of them warm. Not to me. I had just handed my niece the expensive phone, still wrapped in its sleek box, still carrying the invisible price of every overtime hour I hadn't billed, and she tore through the packaging with the kind of joy that never once turned toward me. Her eyes locked on the screen before the lid had even touched the floor. "Mom says if you disappeared tomorrow, nobody would even care," she chirped as she peeled away the protective plastic, her fingers delicate and dismissive, as though removing the last layer between her and her new life meant peeling me away too, the words delivered like a punch wrapped in gift wrap, and the timing perfect enough to be rehearsed. The laughter came like a wave, sharp, fast, collective, as if they'd all just heard the greatest joke, one I hadn't been told, one I hadn't agreed to, but had become the punchline of, while I stood there holding the ribbon, still smiling like a fool, nodding like I always did, because that's what they expected from the man who always fixed, always funded, never mattered. I looked around that room, my sister Miriam on the couch, legs curled up, eyes on her phone, not even pretending to hide her amusement. My mother in the kitchen, stirring a pot she didn't need to stir, her back turned, but her shoulders lifted, betraying her quiet approval of the cruelty. And my father on the recliner, lifting his beer and muttering, "Well, the girl's not wrong," just loud enough for it to land, but soft enough to pretend it hadn't meant anything at all. Uncle Ray snorted hard enough to choke. Cousins exchanged glances and laughs, and even my youngest nephew, barely 10, clapped his hands like he'd witnessed a magic trick, not realizing that the real disappearing act hadn't happened yet, but it would very soon. I stood still, taking in every sound, every smirk, every word left hanging in the air like smoke, thick and hard to breathe through, and in that moment I felt smaller than I'd ever felt, not because they were right, but because I had let them believe I would always stand there and take it. The phone buzzed in my pocket, a scheduled bank alert, probably a payment I'd set up weeks ago for the family's utilities, or Miriam's streaming subscriptions, or the shared insurance plan I'd forgotten to pull out of, and in that buzz, something clicked in my chest. Not anger, not even sadness, but clarity, cold and precise. So I smiled, nodded once more because they'd notice if I didn't, and pulled out my phone, tapping it twice. Not hard, not dramatic, just 2 calm, silent taps like clockwork, like muscle memory. And with that, it began. Every card canceled, every bill rescinded, every auto pay removed, every safety net they thought would always be there gone. They didn't notice. Not yet. They were still laughing, still riding the high of my humiliation, still thinking I was the fool who wouldn't leave, who wouldn't dare to reclaim what he gave away. And maybe they were right for a long time, but not anymore. I watched as my niece, already shoulder to shoulder with her mother, didn't say thank you, didn't look up, just swiped across the phone with the kind of entitlement that gets passed down like a family heirloom, and I felt the tightness in my throat twist into something quieter, something dead. My mother's voice rose again. "All right, everyone, cake time." Her tone bright and cheerful like none of it had happened, like I was just part of the wallpaper again, expected to take photos, to clap, to smile, to play my role. Instead, I walked slowly into the kitchen, leaned my back against the counter, and watched them gather, their voices blending into one shapeless hum. Candles lit, songs sung, eyes shining, and I curled my hands in a fist so tight I could feel the skin press into the edges of my nails, feel the heat rising behind my eyes, but not spilling, never spilling. Something in me cracked, Not loudly, not dramatically, but finally like a joint that's been strained too long. And I knew I wouldn't stay until the last slice was cut. Wouldn't wait for anyone to ask how I was. Wouldn't collect their plates and clean their messes like I always did. I left early, slipped out the side door into the night with nothing but my keys and a quiet rage coiled deep in my chest, and I drove home without turning on the radio, without calling anyone, without giving them the satisfaction of another word. At home, I moved slowly, packing just a few things into a canvas bag, some clothes, my passport, the old watch I never wore, the spare set of keys, and then I pulled out the black backpack from the back of my closet, the one no one ever touched, the one I hadn't thought about in years, but tonight it had a new purpose. I filled it carefully, deliberately, not with clothes or cash or plans to run, but with something heavier, something they wouldn't expect, and when I drove back, the street was quiet, the lights still on in the living room. Laughter still leaking out the windows like nothing had shifted, like I hadn't already started the fire. I slipped in through the unlocked back door, walked down the hallway without anyone noticing, and left the backpack at the foot of the stairs, zipped tight, its weight pressing into the carpet, silent but waiting. And then I left again, this time for real. No one saw me go. Of course they didn't. I was already gone. The next morning arrived with the gray hush of a cloudy sky, and the metallic taste of resolve still sitting on my tongue. And while the world outside carried on, as if nothing had changed, inside my chest there was a quiet thrum of finality, the kind that doesn't scream or plead, but settles deep in your bones and says, you're done. I had spent the night in a short-stay rental on the far side of town, a cheap, unremarkable place with peeling wallpaper and a stiff mattress that smelled faintly of cleaning spray and something older. And even though I barely slept, I felt more rested than I had in years, like my muscles had finally stopped clenching beneath someone else's weight. My phone stayed silent that morning, not because they hadn't noticed yet, but because their shock hadn't curdled into panic. They were still waking up in the afterglow of their own joke, still laughing over coffee and toast, still unaware that the scaffolding holding up their comfort had been dismantled plank by plank while they blew out candles. When the first message came in, a simple, "Hey, the internet's not working," from my sister, I didn't even flinch, just watched the bubble pop up and vanish again, unread, unanswered, irrelevant, because I already knew that behind that question lay a string of unpaid bills, forgotten balances, and accounts now flagged inactive, the digital equivalent of locks clicking shut. A minute later came another, this time from Mom. "Julian, the utilities app is asking for a new payment method. Did something expire?" And this one almost made me laugh. Not because it was funny, but because it was so perfectly her passive-aggressive concern masquerading as curiosity, as if her asking nicely could reverse what I'd already buried. By the time Dad tried calling, his name blinking on my screen like a dying signal, I was already checking out of the rental, keys dropped into the lockbox, bag slung over my shoulder, face calm and unreadable as I walked past a family in the lobby arguing over room service charges, the father's voice rising in frustration in a way that felt eerily familiar. I turned my phone to silent, shoved it deep into my jacket pocket, and made my way to the next location I had in mind. Not a hotel this time, but an old friend's spare room, a temporary landing spot arranged weeks ago under the pretense of needing space while I restructured some contracts, a half-truth they hadn't questioned because I never asked for anything before. He handed me the keys with a nod, didn't ask for details, didn't pry, just said, "Stay as long as you need," and that was more grace than my own family had shown me in a decade. So I thanked him with a quiet sincerity and promised to be gone before month's end, already planning not to stay a day past 2 weeks. Back at the house, my old house, their house, the place that had become a shrine to obligation and guilt, I imagined the moment they found the backpack. Not because I was obsessing, but because I knew them too well, knew how it would go step by step, voice by voice, denial collapsing into confusion, then swelling into outrage. I picture Miriam being the first to see it, probably stepping over it at first, too busy yelling in her phone about the internet outage to notice a change in her surroundings, until some curious twitch made her turn and unzip it, expecting maybe a forgotten birthday gift or some other mess I'd left behind, and instead finding truth stacked neatly in rows. Inside that bag was not evidence of rebellion, not money or weapons or hidden secrets, but documentation, Printed statements, receipts, signed forms, annotated spreadsheets that laid out every dollar I had contributed in the past 8 years, every bill I'd covered, every loan I'd swallowed, so they could breathe without thinking, every autopay that disappeared into the background of their lives like magic. There were letters, too, not sentimental ones, but short, factual summaries I'd written out, one for each of them, explaining what was mine, what I'd covered, and when it stopped, signed with nothing but my name and the date. The night of the party, the moment of my exit, the end of my role. I didn't do it to prove a point. I did it to end the argument before it began. There would be no confusion, no twisting of facts, no manipulative phone calls pretending I was never there. They would see in black and white exactly who had carried them, and exactly when I decided to stop. The first real fallout didn't come until later that afternoon. I was sipping burnt coffee at the kitchen table of the guest apartment, scrolling through listings for short-term rentals, when my phone lit up again, not with a text this time, but with a stream of missed calls, one after another, rapid and insistent, like a pulse rising in panic. I didn't answer any of them. Then came the doorbell at the main gate, a call from the host downstairs. "Hey man, I think your folks are here." And just like that, the quiet I had earned was pierced by the chaos I had escaped, the shouts faint through the walls, but unmistakably Dad's voice demanding to be let in, demanding I explain myself, demanding I undo what I had done. I didn't go down. I didn't respond. I stayed exactly where I was, in that borrowed kitchen with the sun slipping through half-closed blinds, and I let him scream himself hoarse at a closed door while the neighbors watched with narrowed eyes and the landlord threatened to call the cops. Eventually, he left, and I waited an hour before checking the hallway, listening for footsteps, watching the camera feed from the stairwell to make sure he was truly gone. This time, I didn't feel scared. I felt clean. That night, I turned off my phone completely, locked it in the guest room drawer, made myself pasta, poured a glass of wine, and ate slowly while the city moved on around me, unaware that something had shifted permanently beneath its surface. I slept better than I had in years, and for the first time, there were no nightmares, no phantom alerts, no guilt curled in my gut like a parasite. I was gone, and they knew it. They just hadn't figured out what that really meant yet. The pounding on the apartment door came before the sun had fully risen, before the birds outside had begun their morning chorus, before the sky had shed its dusky blue for anything brighter. And it wasn't polite, it wasn't hesitant, it wasn't the kind of knock meant to announce a visitor, but rather the kind of angry, frantic pounding that said, "Open up or I will break this damn thing down." I stood in the hallway of my temporary apartment, bare feet on cold tile, the robe I'd thrown on barely tied, staring at the door like it was a portal to a life I'd already burned, listening as my father's voice bellowed through the wood, thick with rage and desperation. "Julian, open this door. You think you can just vanish? You think you can screw us over like this and get away with it?" The walls around me trembled with each hit, the sound echoing down the hall like a storm in a hallway that should have been silent. And even though part of me wanted to yell back, to scream through the door that this wasn't sudden, that this had been building for years, I said nothing because silence, I had learned, was the only language they truly feared. "I know you're in there," he shouted again, his voice cracking around the edges, no longer smooth and sharp like it used to be, but gravelly and wild, the sound of someone losing their grip on a lie they believe they controlled. "You think you're better than us? You think cutting us off makes you a hero? You're a coward, Julian. Always were, always will be." I didn't move, didn't even breathe loudly, just stood and listened, every word branding itself into the moment like scratches on glass. Not because it hurt, not anymore, but because this was exactly why I had walked away, not from poverty, not from obligation, but from this endless, soul-draining performance of control. His voice dropped for a moment, softer but more dangerous, and I leaned closer to hear the shift. "You think this is over? You think we won't come back? You're wrong. You'll need us before we need you. You'll see, when nobody else gives a damn about you, when your precious little escape falls apart." I leaned my forehead against the door, not with sadness, not with doubt, but with the calm satisfaction of someone who finally understood that nothing they said now could hurt me more than everything they had said before, when I was still under their roof, still under their thumb, still swallowing my own voice to keep the peace. Eventually the pounding stopped, the hallway fell quiet again, and after a pause, I heard his retreating footsteps, heavy and unbalanced, a door slam in the distance, an engine start, and then nothing, just the distant hum of morning traffic far below the window. I didn't go back to bed. Instead, I made coffee, stood by the window, and watched the city come alive, not as a man running from something, but as someone finally still, finally detached, finally untethered from the chaos he once called family. By mid-morning, the silence broke again, this time with a message alert flashing on my computer, not from them, but from my employer at Company B, where I've been handling post-production for a regional campaign that required as much diplomacy as it did skill. Julian, the message read, "A woman came by the office asking for you. She said she was your sister. We had security escort her out, but she caused a bit of a disruption. Let us know if we should be concerned." I closed the tab without replying, heart beating steady, mind already picturing her storming through the glass lobby in her designer knockoffs. Voice raised just enough to attract attention, eyes puffy and wild from a cocktail of late-night panic and the realization that I had, in fact, made good on my threat. They never believed I'd actually leave. They thought I'd sulk, maybe disappear for a weekend, eventually return like a loyal dog who always came back no matter how often it got kicked. But they didn't understand what kind of silence I was capable of once I finally stopped asking for approval. Another knock came late that evening, softer this time, slower, almost apologetic, and I knew it was her before I even looked through the peephole. Her figure hunched slightly in that exaggerated performance of vulnerability she always wore like a costume when she wanted something. I watched her standing there for a long minute, arms crossed, phone in hand, eyes darting between the door and the hallway camera like she was debating whether to scream or cry or call someone else to come scream for her. And when she finally leaned in close and whispered my name like a secret, I stepped back and turned off the hallway light. She didn't knock again, not that night, and I imagined her pacing the street below, texting frantically, probably crafting some version of the story where I was the villain who'd abandoned a helpless family. Never mind the years of carrying them, the bills in my name, the birthdays paid for with rent money, the silent sacrifices that were never enough. I stayed inside. I didn't call anyone. I didn't even post online because I didn't want pity or performance. I just wanted peace. The next morning brought more. Voicemail after voicemail, stacking up like bricks in a wall they were desperate to tear down, each one a little more frantic, a little more pleading, and eventually one from my mother that said, "Julian, sweetheart, we know you're hurt, but this isn't the way. You're breaking our hearts. We raised you. We love you. Please come home." But she didn't mention the party. She didn't mention the phone. She didn't mention the laughter. Because in their world, the crime was never what they said. It was that I reacted to it. I didn't reply, didn't even save the message, just deleted it and went for a walk around the neighborhood, letting my legs move without purpose, letting the cool air wrap around me like something earned, not given. They had found a backpack by now, I was sure, had opened it, had read the documents, had flipped through each printed receipt, each annotated invoice, each timeline of dependency that laid bare the reality they never wanted to admit, and the silence that followed wasn't just shock. It was fear. Not of losing me, but of what came next. Because if I could walk away, if I could prove I was never the weak one, then what were they left with? Just themselves. And that was the one thing they never prepared for. It was nearly noon when the second confrontation came, louder and more invasive than the first, because this time they didn't knock. They barged in, my parents, both of them storming through the front door like they still owned every space I occupied, like their history with me gave them some unspoken right to break boundaries I hadn't even fully rebuilt yet. I had forgotten that the spare key I left at the old house, the one tucked in a ceramic jar by the stairs, the one I never thought to reclaim because I never imagined I'd need to, was still in their possession, and the sound of the door slamming open felt like a violation that reached deeper than any insult they'd ever flung at me. "Julian," Dad's voice boomed through the hallway before I even turned the corner, his face red, lips pulled back like he was fighting not just with me, but with the unraveling of his own illusions. And behind him came my mother, her eyes wide and glassy, her mouth trembling in that way that always preceded a guilt-laced monologue about family and sacrifice and disappointment. "You think this is a joke?" he shouted, stepping toward the kitchen where I stood frozen, holding a half-eaten sandwich, wondering how the hell we had arrived at this point so quickly, yet knowing deep down that we had always been heading here, and I had simply delayed the inevitable by pretending I could keep peace with people who only respected war. "I want you out," I said, not raising my voice, not flinching, not making a scene, just planting the words like a wall between us, a line in the sand drawn in a voice colder than steel and twice as final. "You don't get to do this," he growled, his hand slamming against the edge of the counter, as if he could shake the conviction out of me by force, his eyes narrowing like a cornered dog ready to bite. "You don't get to abandon your own blood and act like we're the problem." "You used me," I answered, the word sharp, but even, my grip tightening around the edge of the countertop. "You used my name, my credit, my time, my silence, and now that it's over, you're calling it abandonment, but it's not abandonment when someone stops being your doormat. It's survival." Mom stepped forward then, her voice catching as she reached toward me like I was still that quiet boy in the back seat who cried when they left him behind at school pickup. "Julian, we were just trying to keep things together. You know how hard it's been since your father retired, since Miriam's separation. You know we didn't mean to hurt you." "I know exactly what you meant," I replied, brushing past her hand as I walked toward the living room, putting distance between us not because I was afraid, but because I didn't want to scream, didn't want to be like them. "You meant to keep me on a leash made of guilt and obligation, and now that I've cut it, you're scrambling to pull me back." Dad followed, slower now, like my calmness made him nervous, like he couldn't decide whether to shout or beg, and his voice came quieter this time, but no less sharp. "We're in trouble, all right? The cards aren't working, the mortgage bounced, Miriam's car got repossessed yesterday. You think this is funny?" I turned to him then, looked him in the eye for the first time in what felt like months, and I let him see it. Let him see the absolute emptiness I had left for him, the reservoir of care that had run dry. "Everything you're losing now was something I kept afloat for years. Your comfort came from my exhaustion, and I'm done." He laughed then, short, bitter, like he was trying to mask fear with bravado, and leaned against the doorway like he needed support. "Oh, so what now? You gonna write a book about how noble you are? How your evil parents sucked the life out of you while you nobly funded the empire of ungratefulness?" "No," I said, stepping closer, not out of aggression but precision, because I wanted him to hear every word clearly, wanted nothing to get lost in noise. "I'm not writing a book. I'm living a life that doesn't revolve around people who only see me as useful when I'm silent and disposable when I speak." His hand clenched at his side like he was debating whether to strike something, the counter, the table, me, but he didn't move, not because he was holding back, but because he didn't know what to do without a target that flinched, without a son who lowered his eyes and apologized for existing. "You ungrateful brat," he muttered, the words barely leaving his throat, like he knew they weren't landing anymore, like he was finally starting to realize this wasn't a phase or a tantrum or some attention grab. This was the end. "Try it," I said, and the moment the words left my mouth, the tension in the room thickened, the challenge hanging between us like the moment before a punch. But he didn't move, just stood there, shaking, deflating, aging in front of me like a balloon leaking every ounce of authority he thought he still carried. "We raised you," Mom said again, softer this time, her voice cracking under the weight of script she'd repeated too many times. "We gave you everything, food, clothes, school, and now you just walk away like we meant nothing?" "You raised me," I said, walking to the door and holding it open wide. "And then you bled me, and now you're leaving." Her mouth opened, but the words died before they reached her tongue, and Dad looked like he might fight one more round. But even he knew there was nothing left in the tank, nothing left in me to bruise. He walked past me with a grunt, muttering under his breath about ungratefulness, about failure, about how I'd come crawling back when the world turned cold. And Mom lingered for just a second longer, tears beginning to pool at the edges of her eyes, not because she was heartbroken, but because she didn't know what to do when her performance stopped working. As I stepped into the hallway, I didn't slam the door. I closed it quietly, because I wanted them to hear it latch. I wanted them to know that the softest sound could still mean never again. By the time the elevator dinged open at the building where I worked, I already knew something was wrong. Not because anyone had texted me, Not because of the subtle shift in the air, but because of the way two receptionists looked up from their desks in sync, eyes slightly wider than usual, their smile strained in that particular way people smile when they don't want to be part of the mess unfolding behind them. I didn't need to ask if she had been here. I could feel the residue of her voice still echoing faintly through the space, the kind of shrill, indignant tone that bounced off glass and concrete like it belonged, like it demanded to be heard. And I knew exactly how it would have played out because I'd seen it before, just not in a lobby full of coworkers. She just showed up, my manager whispered later, pulling me into the corner of the break room like he was delivering classified information, his hands fidgeting with a coffee stirrer, claimed it was urgent, something about family, but she wouldn't leave when asked, ended up yelling at the security guard, said you were hiding, said you owed her answers. She's not coming back. I replied, my voice calm but firm, the edge of finality sharp enough to draw a boundary. She's not my problem anymore. And while he nodded, slowly, awkwardly, I could see the question in his eyes, the curiosity he didn't voice, the story he wanted without asking, but I gave him nothing else, because I wasn't here to perform damage control, wasn't here to explain myself like some teenager caught skipping school. I was here to work and breathe and exist without them dragging their chaos into every corner of my life. That afternoon I left early, not because I was afraid, but because I knew how this game worked. The escalation always came in waves, and once the first public stunt failed, the next would follow fast and ugly, and I didn't want to give them an audience, didn't want to let them stay in another space that still felt clean. Sure enough, as I approached the corner near my apartment building, I saw them. Not both parents this time, but my sister pacing the sidewalk in front of the entrance like she had every right to be there, like this was her domain, and I had merely borrowed it without permission, her phone clutched in her hand like a weapon, eyes darting between every passing face. The doorman met me at the side entrance, eyes apologetic but hesitant, and before I could ask, he started explaining, voice low, she's been here over an hour, demanding to speak with you. Said it's life or death. Said you were ruining everything. I try to get her to leave, but she won't listen. Has she touched anyone? I asked, already knowing the answer, but needing to draw the line officially. And when he shook his head no, I nodded once and said clearly, next time, call security before she steps onto the property. If she returns, she doesn't get to stand here yelling. She gets removed. He hesitated, probably wondering if this was just a family spat that could be solved with a little patience and understanding, probably thinking about his own mother or sister or cousin who showed up drunk and sad and loud, and who just needed one more chance, but I gave him no space to negotiate. She doesn't get to do this, I said, walking past him, my voice low but sharp. Not anymore. Upstairs, the walls felt thinner somehow, like her presence below had stretched the air taut. Like even from 5 stories up, I could feel the weight of her gaze scanning every window, every shadow, hoping for a glimpse of someone who would crack open the door and say, let's talk. But I didn't look down, didn't acknowledge the performance, didn't waste breath on a conversation that would only spiral. I simply unpacked my bag, washed my hands, made tea, and sat by the window in silence, letting the minutes pass until I finally saw security arrive, their bright vests moving like a wave of finality across the sidewalk. They spoke with her calmly at first, and I saw the moment her arms flailed, her voice rising, her body jerking forward like she still believed rage could win this war. But they didn't flinch, didn't argue, just escorted her firmly away, her words muffled behind thick glass and distance, and the cold fact that she no longer had access to my peace. That night, I lay in bed and stared at the ceiling, not restless, not afraid, but exhausted in a way that felt clean, the kind of tired that comes from doing what you should have done years ago, from enforcing boundaries no one else will defend if you don't build them in brick and steel. I knew they would try again. People like that don't quit. Not when they're exposed. Not when their survival has depended on your silence for so long that your voice feels like betrayal. And sure enough, just after midnight, my phone buzzed once more. Not a call this time. Not even a message from them directly, but a notification from the building's management system. Your guests have been warned. Repeat visits will result in formal restrictions. They had tried again, and they had failed again. And now, they were running out of doors to knock on. I didn't respond. I didn't report it. I simply turned off the light and let the dark wrap around me like armor, breathing deep into the quiet, letting it fill every crevice they had once occupied. This wasn't the end of their tantrums, but it was the beginning of their silence. Because the more they shouted, the more the world saw who they really were, and the less I had to explain. In the days that followed, I turned off every notification, silenced every app, removed every shortcut to their numbers, and disabled every platform where their voices had once reached me. Not because I was hiding, not because I was afraid of their words, but because I no longer owed them the dignity of access to the life they never respected in the first place. The silence that filled the void they left behind wasn't peaceful at first. It was raw, unfamiliar, almost disorienting, like walking into a room where the walls have been stripped bare, the echoes of your old life still lingering in the corners, whispering your name like a warning or a dare. But I didn't reach back. I didn't scroll through the old texts, didn't replay the voicemails, didn't search for some hidden plea between the insults and guilt trips that would justify letting them back in. I simply let each hour stretch longer than the one before, breathing through the discomfort, reminding myself that this wasn't loneliness. This was healing. And with each passing day, the noise they had built around me, the demands, the expectations, the casual cruelty passed off as jokes, began to recede like a tide that had finally lost the strength to return. They didn't stop, of course. I didn't expect them to, because people like that don't go quiet easily, not when their manipulation has been allowed to root so deeply it thinks it belongs. And so they reached out in waves. First the desperate calls, then the threats, and finally, the messages masked as apologies that were nothing more than thinly veiled accusations in softer tones. Miriam sent a photo the third day after the incident, a grainy shot of their living room in the dark, lit only by a single candle on the coffee table, the shadows long and dramatic, clearly staged, with a caption that read, "We're out of options. Is this really what you wanted?" I didn't respond, because if she had asked that question with any sincerity, she would have remembered that what I wanted was never revenge. What I wanted was peace, respect, a family that didn't treat me like an ATM in human form, a brother who didn't get blamed for boundaries, a son who didn't have to buy affection just to be tolerated. Later that same evening, Mom sent a voice memo, her voice trembling, laced with tears, the kind that once used to break me down without fail, and she said, "Julian, I know you're hurt, and I know we've said things, but this is too much. You're tearing your family apart, sweetheart. We're all falling apart without you." And maybe it would have worked if I hadn't already seen what she sounded like when she thought I wasn't listening, laughing with my father about how sensitive I was, brushing off my exhaustion like it was some inconvenience they had to tolerate for the benefit of free rent and birthday gifts. So I deleted the memo without listening to the rest. I didn't even let it finish downloading, because their grief only ever surfaced when the consequences landed, never when the damage was being done. 2 more days passed, and then the tone shifted again. Dad's messages came next, text after text dripping with fury, some in all caps, others laced with ellipses like he was trying to hold back something vicious. "You're a disgrace," one read. "You think this makes you powerful? It just makes you weak." Then, "Real men don't run from their families. They fix what's broken." And finally, "You'll come crawling back, and we won't be here when you do." I laughed when I read that one. Not because it was funny, not because it stung, but because I knew the truth they were choking on, that they had already tried every door, already reached out to the cousins they barely spoke to, already played the pity card with every distant acquaintance and old friend willing to listen, and no one had come save them. I had been their lifeline, and now they were drowning in the weight of their own arrogance. I spent the next week in near total silence. Not because I was hiding, but because I wanted to feel what it was like to live without a single demand being placed on me, to eat when I was hungry without checking if someone else needed groceries, to go to sleep without worrying if a bounce payment would shut off the heating at their place. I walked the city like a man seeing it for the first time, slow, deliberate, without purpose, lingering outside coffee shops I never entered, watching strangers laugh into their phones, seeing children tug at their parents' sleeves, soaking in the quiet hum of lives that didn't revolve around survival. I stopped by a lake one morning, early enough that the mist still floated over the surface like breath, and sat on a bench with a notebook in my lap, trying to write down what I felt now that I was finally alone, finally untouched, finally unburdened. and I found I didn't have much to write, because there was nothing left to explain. Freedom doesn't need narration. It just needs space. By the time the 10th day rolled around, the messages had slowed, the calls had nearly stopped, and the voicemails were now mostly from unknown numbers I didn't recognize. Probably throwaway accounts they were using to avoid getting blocked. Probably reaching out from borrowed phones or burner apps to say the same things in new voices. I didn't answer any of them. Not because I didn't care, but because caring doesn't require reentry. It requires distance. And the only thing I owed them now was the silence they had always demanded from me when it was convenient, when it protected their comfort, when it preserved their illusion that I would never leave. But I had left, and every second of silence was proof that I wasn't coming back. The message came exactly 13 days after I walked out of their lives and shut every door behind me, buried in a string of other unopened texts and half-hearted voice notes that I no longer even bothered to delete, a single line written without punctuation, like he'd typed it in haste or desperation or both. Game this Saturday, our team is playing, come if you want to talk. I read it 3 times without reacting, without letting it sink in as anything other than what it clearly was. Not a gesture of reconciliation, not a moment of clarity, not even a real invitation, but a setup dressed in nostalgia. A trap baited with the last shared memory that still had emotional weight. A stadium where we used to sit side by side before every word he spoke started to sound like a debt I owed. I didn't reply immediately, didn't throw the phone across the room, didn't even roll my eyes. I just placed it face down on the table and went back to chopping vegetables for dinner because no text, no matter how cleverly disguised, was going to derail the peace I clawed back piece by piece with silence and distance. But by morning, I knew I was going. Not because I wanted to see him. Not because I believed anything he said would come from a place of truth. Not even because I thought there might be a sliver of regret tucked behind the empty bleachers and overpriced hot dogs and memories of when we used to pretend we liked each other. I went because I wanted to end. Not quietly this time. Not through a locked door or a muted phone or another unanswered message, but in person, face to face, with witnesses, with a stadium full of strangers who didn't know our story, who didn't care about our past, who wouldn't take his side simply because he was older or louder or carried a last name that once meant something. I wanted to look him in the eye. I wanted to watch him see the man I'd become, not the son, not the scapegoat, not the ATM or the invisible handyman who patched up every crack in their lives, but the man who finally said no and meant it. The day of the game, I dressed deliberately, plain black hoodie, worn jeans, scuff boots, not sloppy, not polished, just neutral, just unreadable, just invisible enough to blend in with the crowd and slip past whatever plan he thought he'd orchestrated. I took the train 2 hours before kickoff, arriving early enough to wander the outer corridors of the stadium, letting the sounds of anticipation, the vendors shouting, the fans chanting, the smell of pretzels and cheap beer, wash over me like white noise, like static that blurred the edges of the confrontation I was walking toward. Row F, that's what he'd written, and when I finally climbed the metal steps toward the middle of the stands, I saw him right away, sitting alone in a row that should have been packed. A thin circle of empty seats around him like he'd scared off everyone nearby or bought up the surrounding spaces just to make sure no one interrupted whatever scene he was planning to stage. He waved when he saw me, not big, not frantic, just a small flick of the wrist like he was saying, "Good to see you," instead of "I've been plotting this for days." And when I reached the seat beside him, I didn't sit immediately, just stood there, arms folded, eyes scanning the crowd like I had all the time in the world. "You came," he said finally, voice raised just enough to be heard over the roar of the pre-game anthem. "Didn't think you would." "I almost didn't," I replied, my voice steady. No heat, no forgiveness, just the flat tone of someone who already knew how this would play out, but I figured you'd say I was a coward if I didn't show up. He chuckled, low, forced, like he wanted it to sound amused, but couldn't quite mask the tension cracking at the edges, and patted the seat next to him like this was normal, like this was how fathers and sons repaired decades of damage. I sat slowly, my eyes not on him, but on the black backpack he held tight between his knees, the same one I'd left behind almost 2 weeks ago, now faded slightly from sunlight and friction, its zippers slightly undone like he'd been opening it and closing it obsessively, trying to decide what it meant, trying to decide what to do with what he'd found inside. You thought you were slick, he said, leaning in slightly, his breath warm with beer and bravado, leaving that little bag behind like some kind of message. Well, we got it loud and clear. I didn't leave it for you, I replied, glancing sideways at him just long enough to make him flinch. I left it for the truth. You really think anyone's going to care? He asked, his voice rising a bit. Not loud enough to draw attention, but loud enough to betray the crack in his confidence. You think you could just vanish, drop some papers, and walk around like some noble martyr? No, I said, turning to face him fully now, the stadium noise pulsing around us like a living wall. I don't think I'm a martyr. I think I'm done being your lifeline. He scoffed, clutching the backpack tighter like he wanted to throw it or rip it open or maybe just hurl it over the railing and pretend it had never existed. You're bluffing. This is still your family, and you don't just walk away from your blood. I did, I said, and this time I didn't blink. The crowd erupted as the teams took the field, but we didn't move, we didn't cheer, didn't clap, didn't speak, just sat in that strange stillness between the start of the game and the end of whatever illusion he had left. You think you've got power now, he muttered, voice shaking as he tapped the backpack. But all this proves is that you were stupid enough to keep receipts. You think that makes you a victim? No, I said, leaning forward, hands clasped between my knees. It makes me free. He didn't respond. He just stared at the field like he could find some version of himself out there that hadn't already lost. But I had already won. Not with noise, not with fists, but with silence. And a backpack full of truth. The moment he opened the backpack, his hands trembling slightly, his fingers fumbling with the zipper like he couldn't decide whether he wanted to prove a point or rip something apart, I leaned back in my seat and let the sounds of the stadium crowd swell around us. A tide of strangers cheering, jeering, and screaming for plays they didn't yet understand, oblivious to the quiet war unraveling in row F. He didn't pull everything out at once, not like I expected, but instead lifted the top folder slowly, the manila edges curled from being handled too many times, his eyes scanning the bold black headers I'd printed weeks before in preparation for this very moment. And as he read through the itemized breakdown of credit lines, account transfers, interest payments, and overdue balances I'd covered in silence, I saw something flicker across his face that I hadn't seen since I was a child. Confusion, or maybe fear. He looked over at me, voice low now, almost buried beneath the wave of cheers as our home team scored a touchdown, but still sharp enough to cut. So what? You want a trophy for being the family accountant? I didn't take my eyes off the field, didn't look at him, didn't even blink, just spoke clearly enough for the people in the next row to turn their heads slightly, maybe catching the edge of something real cutting through the game day noise. No, I want a clean exit. And this is the receipt. He snapped the folder shut like it had insulted him, his knuckles white against the paperboard, and shoved it back into the backpack with a hiss of breath through his teeth, shaking his head like he was the one betrayed. Like the evidence of his own parasitism was somehow an injustice I had inflicted on him. You act like you're some kind of hero, he spat, louder now, his voice attracting glances from two men behind us, one of whom narrowed his eyes and leaned slightly forward, probably wondering if he was about to witness something worth recording, like you suffered in silence while we lived off your back. But you never said no. Julian, you never once stood up and said you couldn't do it. Because every time I tried, I replied, turning to him fully now, you guilted me, belittled me, dismissed me. Every time I hesitated, you doubled down on the silence you trained me to keep, and every time I swallowed that discomfort to protect your pride, you took more, so don't act like my silence was consent. He opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught somewhere between his lungs and his teeth, and instead of arguing, he pulled out a second stack, the one with handwritten notes, emails, texts printed from my phone, each one time-stamped and dated, each one a reminder of every favor they demanded, every late-night message asking for rent, money, or car insurance, or bill extensions, every promise made and broken in the name of family. You think this will undo what we gave you? He asked, his voice quieter now, less aggressive, more wounded, the last gasp of a man who realized the narrative was slipping from his hands. We raised you, we kept a roof over your head, you gave me the bare minimum and expected applause. I cut in, not with heat, not with spite, just truth. And then you took everything I built on top of that and drained it dry. Convinced that because I had survived, I must owe you more. The silence that followed wasn't total. The stadium roared. The announcer's voice echoed through the speakers. Vendors yelled about cold drinks and hot dogs. But between us, between father and son, there was a vacuum, a pressure drop that settled into the bones of everyone seated close enough to feel that this wasn't just an argument. This was something old and final. "You always had a way with words," he muttered, slumping slightly, the fight draining from his shoulders like someone had opened a valve in his chest. "Always thought you were better than us." "I never thought I was better," I said. "I just wanted different, and when I realized I'd never get it from you, I made it myself." He reached into the backpack again, slower now, more careful, and pulled out the last item, the envelope I'd marked with 3 simple words. "Read if you want the truth." Inside were the copies of documents I had never wanted to show him, never intended to reveal, but kept anyway. The emergency loan I had taken out when Miriam's medical bills got too high and no one else could qualify. The overdraft protection I'd enabled on my own account when their mortgage nearly bounced. The breakdown of every shared utility I'd absorbed when Dad lost his part-time job and decided not to tell anyone. He didn't read all of it. He didn't need to. The weight of it sat between us heavier than the paper ever could. He shoved the envelope back in, zipped the bag shut with a grunt, and dropped it at his feet like it was poison. "You think people are going to take your side?" he said finally, not with anger, but with something worse, resignation, bitterness turned inward, pride collapsing under the pressure of truth. "You think anyone's going to care that you walked away from your own blood?" "I don't need anyone to take my side," I answered, standing up and slinging my bag over my shoulder, "because I'm not asking for validation. I'm living without them." He didn't follow me as I stepped past him, didn't call my name, didn't throw another insult or offer another lie disguised as wisdom. He just sat there, motionless, surrounded by empty seats and pages of history he couldn't rewrite. As I climbed the stairs, a few people glanced at me, curious maybe, or just pulled in the gravity of something unsaid, and for the first time, I didn't feel the need to explain myself. I didn't look back, not because I didn't care, but because I had already said everything that needed saying, and I was done offering closure to people who only wanted control. The fallout began before I even reached the bottom of the stadium stairs, my phone vibrating in the pocket of my hoodie like it had been waiting for the final domino to drop, like someone had pressed in the moment I turned my back, the screen lighting up with message after message that I already knew weren't apologies, weren't admissions, weren't even attempts at peace, just rage, accusation, and that ever-persistent need to twist my silence into cruelty. The first text came from Miriam, barely disguised under the thin veil of her usual venom, her words tumbling over each other in a rapid spiral of blame. "You're a coward for airing our dirty laundry like that," followed by, "Dad says you humiliated him in public," and finally, "You've ruined everything, and for what? Some pride trip?" I didn't even unlock the screen to read the rest. I just turned the phone face down inside my backpack, letting it buzz against the fabric until the battery finally drained, the noise fading into something far less invasive than the voices I'd endured for years. That night, I walked through the city streets without a destination, the crisp evening air curling against my face, the streetlights flickering like blinking eyes in the fog. And for the first time since the day I disappeared, I let myself slow down, let the silence sink in, not just around me, but inside me, the absence of their noise becoming a kind of music I never realized I'd missed. But I knew, even before I made it back to my apartment, even before I slid the key into the lock and stepped inside the dim, familiar stillness, that they wouldn't stop. Not now, not after everything I'd said, everything I'd revealed, because people like that don't surrender when you expose them. They just change tactics. So I wasn't surprised when the next morning I found my landlord waiting outside my door, his face pale and unsure, holding a crumpled note in one hand and a hesitant apology in the other, his voice laced with something that felt almost embarrassed. "Julian, I'm sorry to bother you like this, but they're downstairs again, your father, your sister. They're making a scene in the lobby, refusing to leave." I sighed, stepped aside, and motioned for him to come in, not because I wanted company, but because I wanted him to see it, the peace I'd built, the line I'd drawn, the silence I'd fought so hard to protect. And when he looked around at the neatly folded clothes, the small desk by the window, the untouched dinner on the stove, he nodded like he understood something deeper than words could explain. "I'll call the police," he offered, voice low, careful, almost ashamed to be involved in something so personal, but it would help if you made it clear, officially, that they're not welcome. So I did. I drafted a formal notice on plain white paper, signed it in ink that didn't shake, and handed it to him without a second thought, watching as he read it twice, then folded it into his pocket with a kind of reverence, like it was something heavier than a simple letter, like it was armor. And when the guards finally escorted them out, my father red-faced and shouting, Miriam crying with one hand pressed dramatically to her chest like a martyr in some cheap tragedy. I didn't look through the window, didn't peer through the blinds, didn't try to witness their exit, because I no longer needed proof of their desperation. I could feel it in the silence they used to fill with noise. That afternoon, I received a package, no return address, no tracking number, just a simple brown envelope shoved into my mailbox, sealed with tape, the handwriting on the front unmistakably my mother's, slanted and tight like she had written it quickly and without breathing. Inside was a letter, 3 pages long, written in her signature blue pen, the same kind she used on holiday cards and grocery lists. The ink smudged in places like she tried to hold back tears, but failed, the paper slightly wrinkled from the pressure of her handwriting. The letter didn't start with Dear Julian, didn't even use my name. It just launched into the story I'd heard 100 times before, the one about how hard things had been after Dad's job disappeared, how she'd done her best with what little she had, how the family had always relied on each other, because that's what families do. But the tone shifted on page 2, twisting into something darker, more manipulative, a tightrope walk between apology and accusation. Her words laced with passive blame. We never asked you to give so much, but you didn't exactly say no either. And then, you always made us feel like we owed you. That's not love. Julian, that's control. And by the final paragraph, she wasn't pleading anymore, she was warning. She wrote, You've made your point, but don't think there won't be consequences. Families don't forget betrayal, especially when it's public. I folded the letter neatly, placed it back in an envelope, and dropped the entire thing into the trash without another glance. Not because I was angry, not because I was hurt, but because the only thing worse than their presence was their attempt to rewrite the story from a distance. Later that week, I received an email from an old mutual friend, someone I hadn't spoken to in years, someone whose contact had been dormant until now. The message short, clipped, full of hesitation. Hey, your sister reached out, said you were having some kind of breakdown, just wanted to check in, see if you're all right. I didn't reply. I didn't defend myself. I didn't explain that I wasn't unraveling. I was detangling from them, from their narrative, from a myth that survival must always look like sacrifice. Instead, I closed the laptop, walked outside, and sat on the edge of the old stone fountain near the park, letting the spray hit my face in the breeze, watching children toss bread to ducks and teenagers huddle over phones, all of them existing in a world untouched by my storm. I stayed there until the sky turned orange, until my phone buzzed one last time, until the battery died again, and I didn't bother to recharge it, because if they wanted to scream into the void, they could do it without me. I wasn't listening anymore. I didn't move away. I didn't change my number. I didn't block them from every possible channel the way people sometimes do when they want to disappear completely, because I wasn't trying to erase myself. I wasn't hiding from them, and I wasn't afraid they would find me, not anymore, because the truth was they'd already lost me long before I walked out of that birthday party with a black backpack and the kind of silence that spoke louder than any goodbye. What I did instead was far simpler, far quieter, and far more permanent. I stayed exactly where I was. I walked the same streets. I kept the same apartment. I returned to the same grocery store on Saturday mornings, and I passed the same coffee shop on my way home from the park, but now I did it alone, without glancing over my shoulder, without checking my phone for fallout, and without holding my breath in anticipation of another emotional ambush. They thought their absence would be my undoing. They thought guilt would rot its way back into my life like mold beneath fresh paint. They thought that if they turned everyone against me, spun every shared story into a myth about abandonment and betrayal, then eventually I would come crawling back for forgiveness I never needed to earn in the first place. But nothing happened. No one came. No grand reckoning arrived to punish me for walking away from people who only knew how to love through control and expectation and shame. Instead, What came was the quiet, steady rhythm of a life that no longer required performance, no longer asked me to give what I couldn't afford, no longer measured my worth in silence and sacrifice. I started sleeping better, not just longer, but deeper, waking up without the fog of unfinished conversations and unspoken resentments coiled in the corners of my chest, no longer jolted awake by the imaginary sound of my father's voice in the hallway or my mother's knock on the door, demanding to be heard in the name of family. I ate when I was hungry, not when it was convenient for someone else. I worked when I felt inspired, not when they needed another bill paid. I took walks without a destination, sat on benches just to feel the sun on my neck, and sometimes, just sometimes, I even smiled at strangers, not because I wanted anything from them, but because I finally had something left to give. On Sundays, I passed the old bookstore on C Street, the one I'd always meant to visit but never had the time, the one with the crooked shelves and the handwritten signs taped to the window. And now, I went in without a list, without a plan, letting myself get lost among stories that weren't mine, letting new voices echo in my mind instead of theirs. I filled my apartment with small things that made it feel like home, plants I actually remembered to water, soft lamps instead of harsh overhead lights, secondhand records from the flea market that crackled faintly when they spun, and I realized, one afternoon as I sipped tea in complete silence, that this was what people meant when they said peace of mind. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't dramatic. It was just stillness. One night in early autumn, I passed a family at the park, a father chasing his daughter through the leaves, her laughter high and bright, her scarf trailing behind her like a banner of joy. And for a moment, I froze, watching them with a kind of awe, not envy, not regret, just a strange sense of distance from a life I once thought I needed. I didn't ache for it. I didn't long for it. I simply observed, nodded, and kept walking. The backpack, the one that had detonated everything, now sat on the top shelf of my closet. Not because I needed a reminder of what I had done, but because I liked knowing it was there, a relic of the day I chose myself, a monument to a line that had finally been drawn not in sand, but in ink and paper and action. They tried a few more times, of course. Birthdays passed with empty invitations. Holidays came and went with impersonal text that said, "Thinking of you," but never once included an apology or admission. And still, I said nothing because I wasn't looking for closure, wasn't hoping for change, and wasn't waiting for someone to validate what I already knew was right. Months went by. Winter rolled in with its quiet storms and early nights, and I remained untouched. I stopped checking old voicemails. I stopped wondering if the next knock at the door would be another confrontation. I stopped scanning crowds for faces I once dreaded. Instead, I learned how to cook slow meals, how to repair the fraying cuff of my jacket, how to sit alone in a movie theater and enjoy the quiet between trailers. And somewhere in that slow unraveling of old habits, I found a kind of freedom that no apology could have offered. They didn't disappear. They just faded. Their voices stopped echoing. Their shadows stopped stretching so far across my life. And one morning, as I stood by the window, sipping coffee, watching the city wake up without chaos in my ears, I realized I hadn't thought about them in 3 days, and that, more than anything, felt like healing. I hadn't forgiven them. I hadn't forgotten what they did. But I had reclaimed the part of me they tried so hard to own, and I had no intention of giving it back. I don't know exactly when the silence turned from armor into something softer, something breathable, something that didn't just shield me, but allowed me to live without looking over my shoulder. But I know it happened somewhere between the long walks with no destination and the nights I sat beneath my own ceiling without dread, without urgency, without the crushing weight of obligation pressing into my chest like it used to every time their names flashed across my phone. There's no grand conclusion to stories like this. No neat bow, no final speech, no dramatic apology at the airport gate. Just time stretching out in both directions, past and future. One filled with echoes I no longer answer, and one filled with choices that finally belong to me. Choices I make not in reaction to their chaos, but in service to my own peace. They still exist somewhere in that old house with the peeling paint and the cracked routines, still spinning their narratives, still playing the roles they wrote for themselves long before I walked away. But I don't visit, I don't watch, And I don't worry because I know now that their storm only reaches me when I open the door, and I haven't opened it in a very, very long time. Sometimes I wonder if they think of me, if Dad still tells versions of the story where I'm the villain, if Miriam still rants to her friend about my betrayal, if Mom still writes letters she never sends. But then I catch myself smiling at a stranger, humming under my breath, standing still in the middle of a crowded sidewalk just to feel the wind on my face. And I remember I don't care. Because I didn't escape to prove them wrong. I escaped to remember who I was before their voices taught me to hate the sound of my own. And now, every quiet moment is a victory. Every ordinary day is a revolution. Every breath I take without permission is freedom.